Hi, my name is Jake, and I am a bookish drummer. So for today's video, it's going to be my July wrap-up. I'm going to be talking about all of the books that I managed to read in the month of July. And for this video, it's going to be a little bit more informal. Normally, I try to film in front of the camera and have my face available to all of you and try to hold up the books for all of you, but for today, I'm a little lazy, so I'm just kind of putting them on my bed and just filming them here. This way, it makes it a little bit easier on me, mainly because I don't have to do too much editing for this. So let me know if you guys enjoy this type of video or if you'd rather me be in front of a camera talking. I mean, that's still the plan normally for my videos, but it's sometimes nice to do this instead. Let me know what you guys think. But anyway, enough of the preamble. Let's go ahead and jump right into it. So I have these books in order of when I read them. So I started with this book, and then this book was the last one that I read. And in between here, I have an audiobook that I'll get to, and I'll get to that later. But anyway, the very first book that I read was The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. This is a literary horror novel, and I had a blast reading this. I gave it 4.5 stars. It wasn't quite perfect, but it was damn near perfect, and I had a great time reading it. And I pretty much had no idea what this book was about going into it. I knew that it had something to do with that I knew it was going to have like Native American themes because I mean it's called The Only Good Indians and Stephen Graham Jones is Native American. So I knew going in, that was pretty much the only thing I knew going in. And I also knew that Leslie from The Nerdy Narrative and Evie from She Was Only Evie, they're huge fans of Stephen Graham Jones. So I knew all of that going in. But pretty much I did not know the plot. And I was surprised by the directions that this book went in. And I loved the characters. And it was just overall a very good horror novel. And I plan on reading a lot more Stephen Graham Jones. I love this book, and I gave it 4.5 stars. And it was a great start to the month of July. Then we get to The Maidens by Alex Michaelides. I have no idea how to pronounce that name. But this book was a pretty big disappointment. I got it for Book of the Month, and I ended up giving this book 2.5 stars. I read his other book, The Silent Patient, and I pretty much liked that book. I gave it 4 stars. Wasn't perfect, but I had a pretty good time with it. This book, it didn't really have too much going for it for me. The main character was very boring, and I thought she was pretty dumb. And this book was just ultimately pretty predictable. And even though I kind of had the same complaint with The Silent Patient, even though with that book I was able to guess pretty early on what was going on, it was still a fun book to read. For this book, it was the opposite. It was not a fun read, and I knew what was happening the entire time. And then once you finally figure it out, it's like, well, I already knew this. So this book was pretty big disappointment. Like I said, I gave it 2.5 stars, and I will be unhauling it. Just, I was not a fan. Not a terrible book, but pretty lackluster for me. And then we bounce back with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood by Quentin Tarantino, who is my all-time favorite movie director. And when I found out that he was going to be novelizing one of my favorite movies by him, I was very excited, to say the least. And I was not disappointed. I gave the book 4.5 stars. And again, not a perfect book by any means. This is Tarantino's first novel, I believe, and you can definitely tell because there's a lot of scenes in here that are good, and they're very cool kind of add-ons from the movie. Scenes that weren't included in the movie are included here, but a couple of them, they're all necessary, and I understand why he included them, but some of them just kind of dragged on. Like the second chapter in here, you get Cliff's point of view, and let me see if I can jump to it. Yeah. You get Cliff's point of view here, and it's basically him just talking about movies for like 30 pages. And that could have been like a cool like 5-page section of a chapter, but it just went on and on and on. But obviously Tarantino, is a movie guy, so that makes sense. That was kind of my biggest complaint with the book. Everything else, maybe I had a little bit of nitpicks here and there, but I overall very much enjoyed this book. I do think, though, that if you're not already a huge fan of this movie, you probably shouldn't read it, because a lot of the stuff that's in the book, well, I mean, obviously it's referencing the movie, but I just don't think it would be very enjoyable for people who already haven't seen the movie. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't read it, but just go into it knowing that you'll probably like it more if you watch the movie first. But like I said, I love this book. I gave it 4.5 stars, and I'm very interested to see what Quentin Tarantino will write in the future. I do hope that he novelizes some of his earlier movies, like Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction, which is my favorite movie of all time. But I'm also hoping that he'll write something original one day. And then the fourth book I read in July was Mongrels by Stephen Graham Jones, the same author as The Only Good Indians. I decided to jump into this book because I was very excited about Stephen Graham Jones. This book, however, I did not quite like as much as The Only Good Indians. I didn't hate it, but I only gave it 3 stars. This is more of his werewolf novel, and it was written in a very peculiar way where it was back and forth between like the main character, and then there were these weird like interlude chapters with characters that I didn't really know what was going on in them, and I didn't really get the point of them. And that part of the book, or those chapters of the book, I just was not a huge fan of. But the main character and what goes on in his story was pretty good, but wasn't nowhere as good as The Only Good Indians. But I'm definitely glad that I read it, even though that I didn't enjoy it as much as The Only Good Indians. It was still an interesting read, and I'm glad I read it because Stephen Graham Jones likes to take all of these horror conventions and horror tropes and kind of spin them on their head. And while this is a werewolf story and we've all read or have seen tons of werewolf stuff, he definitely puts his own spin on it. And I definitely value that in an author, where he's not just kind of regurgitating these past tropes and these past, stories. He's coming up with something new, and I admire that. So I will definitely be reading more Stephen Graham Jones in the future, even though I only really gave this book 3 stars. And then the book that I read after that was Vicious by V.E. Schwab. Now, this book was amazing. This was probably, well, I'd have to think about it, but this is definitely one of the best books that I read in July. I gave it 5 stars. I read it pretty much in a 24-hour setting. Now, it helps that the chapters are very short. You can see that. And it's a relatively short book, but I flew through this book, and it was just so much fun. So Vicious is about these 2 rivals who figure out that when you have near-death experiences and you die and you come back to life, you can sometimes gain the ability to have these certain superpowers. And they're kind of rivals, but it's told in a non-linear format, and it jumps from the present to the past to the present to the past, and you're trying to figure out why they're rivals. And I just love non-linear timelines. Like I said, I'm a huge Tarantino fan, and all of his movies are pretty much non-linear, and I love that about his movies. And same thing with Vicious, and I am very eagerly waiting to read the sequel, Vengeful. I really want to jump into that in August. And like I said, this book was easily one of the best books I've read this month and this year. 5 stars easily. And the next book I read after that would be Malice by John Gwynne, which is the first book in the Faithful and the Fallen series. And I enjoyed it. I did not love it. I gave it 4 stars. And I think that's pretty normal for this book. A lot of people, even though they love The Faithful and the Fallen, they say that the first book can get a little bit getting used to, and that the following books 2, 3, and 4, are vastly superior. So I'm not surprised that I didn't give it 5 stars, and I'm anxious to read Valor in August to see if my opinion of it grows. Hopefully I like it more than Malice, and hopefully I don't like it less. We'll see. But Malice, it was pretty good. I very much wish that it had a glossary, because there was just so many friggin' names of people and places, and I was, for like the first half of the book, there's a lot of stuff where I didn't really know what was going on, and it took me a little bit of while to get used to everything. The writing style itself is pretty straightforward, but just keeping all of the character names together was just a task. And sometimes I would like read a chapter and then I was like, wait a minute, what happened again? And I'd have to go back and reread it. But from what I got from it, I did enjoy it, and I gave it 4 stars. And hopefully Valor is an improvement. And that one does have a glossary, which I'm excited for. The next book I read was Winds of Strife by U.G. Gutman. And this book was kind of like Malice. This book was pretty good. It wasn't perfect, and I'm pretty sure this is Gutman's debut novel, which makes sense. Your debut novel is not going to be perfect, but there was a lot about this book that I absolutely loved. The characters were great, and especially the main character. He was definitely a how do I describe him? A morally gray character, where he's doing bad things, but at the same time you kind of understand why he's doing them, but you're very conflicted about him. And I love main characters that are written like that. They're way more interesting and intriguing than just a stereotypical good guy or a stereotypical bad guy, right? Like, having complicated characters to read about is definitely a plus for me. And the magic system and the setting was all very good. Like I said, this book wasn't perfect, but I gave it 4 stars, and I'm definitely anxious to read the sequel whenever he announces that. I'm not sure when that will be, but whenever he releases it, I will definitely be pre-ordering it. And then this book was actually a reread for me, Wonderland by Zoe Stage, one of the most underrated horror books that I've ever read. Zoe Stage is the author of Baby Teeth, which is one of my all-time favorite horror books, and that has a decently low rating on Goodreads. I think it has like a 3.6, which is fairly low, which I don't really understand, because I thought that book was amazing. But then you look at the ratings for this book, good God. I don't really quite understand it either, but it has a 3.1 rating on Goodreads, which is ridiculously low. And luckily though, for this book, most of those ratings are like 3 stars. So a lot of people only give this book 3 stars. There's not too many 1 or 2 stars, but at the same time, there's not a lot of 4 or 5 star reads, which I don't understand, because I thought this book was amazing. It starts out kind of like as a modern retelling of The Shining, where you got this family and they're moving into a new house. They used to live in the city, but now they're moving into a more secluded, wintry area. And so you got, the husband and wife, and you got the 2 kids, and then some weird, spooky stuff starts happening. But then, the second half of the book kind of goes in a direction that I was not expecting to go that I was not expecting to go down. And maybe that section is what people don't like about it, but I absolutely loved it. And this is the second time I've read this book. And she actually has a new book coming out in August called Getaway that I'm very excited to read. So I kind of wanted to read this book just to jump back into her writing style. And like I said, this book is just criminally underrated. For any fans of like literary horror, I would highly recommend this book. And then in between these two books, I read the first book in the Fred the Vampire Accountant series. It's got a long, weird title. I think it's called The Utterly Uninteresting and Unadventurous Tales of Fred the Vampire Accountant. I think that's correct. I kind of just I started listening to it on a whim. I watched a video of Pete from Ponderings of Pete, and he talked about that, and I was like, that sounds fairly amusing. So I used a Audible credit and I listened to it, and I had such a blast. It's such a it's such a stupid it's so stupid, but like it's so funny and whimsical and just so entertaining that I just had a blast listening to it. And it does help that it's narrated by my favorite narrator, Kirby Hayborn. Like, his narration just works perfectly for that character. And I honestly think it's going to be one of my new favorite series because it's just so stupid, but it's so entertaining. And yeah, I'm definitely going to be listening to more of that series. That first book was excellent. I gave it 4.5 stars. It wasn't perfect, but I mean, a fucking series about a vampire accountant is not going to be perfect. So, it's going to be real fun though, and I plan on getting into the second book in August. But that first book I gave 4.5 stars. And the last book, the 10th book I read this month, is by one of my new favorite writers, and that would be Maybe in Another Life by Taylor Jenkins Reid. Now, I just started reading Taylor Jenkins Reid this year. I've read her 3 newest books. Daisy Jones and the Six is a top 10 book for me of all time. I love that book. And I also read The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo and Malibu Rising. Those are both 5-star reads as well. For this book, I really didn't hear too many people talking about this book. It's one of her older books, so I guess that kind of makes sense. I think this book came out when she was, relatively famous, but not nearly as famous after she wrote Evelyn Hugo and Daisy Jones. So I didn't really know too much about this book going into it, and I wasn't sure if I would like it nearly as much as her other 3 books, but I'm happy to say that I absolutely loved this book. I gave it 5 stars, and I'm not quite sure how I would compare it to the other 3 books, but I mean, I just love her writing style, her character work, and just how immediate her prose is and her writing style. I love everything about Taylor Jenkins Reid. Oh man, this is just turning into a gush for Taylor Jenkins Reid. Just, man, she's just such a fantastic writer. How have I never read any Taylor Jenkins Reid before this? And honestly, this book was such a fresh breath of air after reading all of these kind of like horror books and fantasy books, and just, it was a nice change of pace. So maybe that's why I had such a good time with it. But like I said, her character work is just phenomenal. And she has the unique ability to make me laugh, make me, not cry, but make me sad and entertain me all in one book in such a short amount of time. She's just a fantastic writer. And I plan on definitely reading more of her books in the future. I can't buy any more books this month because I'm putting myself on a book buying ban. We'll see how long that lasts. If I do break it, it'll probably be me buying more Taylor Jenkins Reid books. Hopefully not, but, well, actually, hopefully, but I'm going to try not to. But anyway, those are all of the books that I read in the month of July, including the Vampire Accountant book that I did on audiobook. These are all the physical ones. And if I had to pick a favorite, oh man, that would be rather difficult. These 3 books are all 5 stars. Oh, this is a reread for me, so maybe that shouldn't count. Vicious. These are just 2 totally different books. I don't know. Gun to my head, I would just have to pick Taylor Jenkins Reid. Like I said, I love her writing style. But I love Vicious, though. Maybe I'll just have to wait and see how the sequel is, but... So I'll go with this. This was my favorite book of the month, and then my least favorite would definitely be The Maidens. Big disappointment, and it will definitely be unhauled. Not a huge fan of that book. Whew! Man. Anywho, please let me know if you guys have read any of these books, and if you liked them or disliked them, or if you're excited to read them like I did in the month of July. Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for watching and have a terrific day. Who's a constant reader who owns a lot of books? It's Bookish Drummer. Should that be my new intro, guys?